Alright, my name is Trey Sherwood, and this will be my week 12 video, so I'll just go ahead and jump into the first question. When is it appropriate for a country or an organization to intervene in another country? Obviously, justifications for intervention include genocide, conflict, human rights violations, but intervention can be largely controversial, and because of that, there's a lot of factors that need to be acknowledged before intervening. Such factors include impartiality. It's very important that a country has good, clear intentions and a humanitarian agenda, and that they're not there just serving their own self-interests or promoting their own agenda. The whole goal is to end human suffering, and that can't be done if a country that's intervening is biased towards one group over the other or has their own interests at heart. And so there also needs to be a promotion of universal standards, meaning things such as a large scale of loss of life, ethnic cleansing, genocide, mass rape. These are all things that are universally unacceptable, and so these are the issues that need to be resolved when intervening, rather than issues that remain controversial on a universal scale. So like I said, the main goal is to end human suffering. So it's very important that you've exhausted all non-military options before deciding to use force in intervention, meaning using sanctions, embargoes, trying to negotiate before using actual physical violent force to change the regime or stop the violence. And then it's also very important to have reasonable prospect, meaning a high chance of success. And so you shouldn't intervene unless you have a clear-cut strategy that's going to ensure success and is reasonable. Because especially if you're going to use force within another country, you want to minimize as much violence as possible. And so it's very important to have, a high reasonable prospect. And so an example that illustrates this point would be NATO, which was largely backed by the United States. Used coercive diplomacy in Bosnia, meaning they gave Bosnia an ultimatum, and when Bosnia did not meet the deadline, NATO ended up bombing Serbia, Belgrade, and all the locations of the Bosnia Serbs in order to put an end to that violence. And so this is a good example of appropriately intervening because there was an ultimatum given, there was a chance to negotiate and avoid the bombings, but unfortunately when the Bosnian Serbs did not meet this deadline, they were forced to bomb anyway. Another example would be Iraq. Starting from the 90s, the United States wanted a regime change, and they wanted to prevent the production of weapons of mass destruction. And so some of the tactics they used, airstrikes, sanctions, embargoes, no-fly zones. Unfortunately, this was not very successful, but in the 2000s, the United States wanted to inspect weapons. They still wanted a regime change. And so some of the tactics used then were United Nations condemnation, congressional support, and a threat to use force to acquire a regime change. Even though a regime change has still not been acquired, the second time around, this intervention was largely more successful, probably because Iraq took the United States more seriously from their experiences in the past. And so the next question, what are the best policies for promoting peace after a war ends? So Koban gives a lot of, she gives 8 suggestions or meta tasks that should be in mind when peace building after conflict. A few of them I'll go ahead and list off here. Overcoming communal and official denial of the atrocity, gain public acknowledgement, obtain the facts in an account as full as possible in order to meet the victim's need to know, building a record for history, and to ensure minimal accountability and visibility of the perpetrators. Number 3, to me this is the most important in building peace after war, which is forge the basis for a domestic democratic order that respects and enforces human rights. And I'll talk about that a little bit more when we get to the actual case studies of Rwanda, South Africa, and Mozambique. Other meta-tasks lists include, promoting reconciliation across social divisions, reconstructing the moral and social systems devastated by the violence. So That's also pretty important because in Rwanda, a lot of the violence was because of ethnic differences that were largely instilled by government and outside factors. I just think it's so interesting that the Hutus and the Tutsis were actually forced to self-identify and to actually wear identification tags, and in order to wedge and separate ethnic distinction and promote violence and hostility. And so it's very important that Hutus and Tutsis don't identify as one or the other, but rather as Rwandans, in order to unify the nation and decrease further violence and segregation. I'll go ahead and get to the case study rather than keep listing off all the meta tasks. So in the case study between Rwanda, South Africa, and Mozambique, obviously the main difference between the cases is that Rwanda ended the war through military victory, whereas South Africa and Mozambique ended the war through years of negotiation. And so these differences have a profound impact on the policies that were implemented after the war because of the different ways the war was ended. So Rwanda, for example, was under no obligation to hold any type of elections or create a democratic environment because it was a military victory, and they were also under no obligation to offer amnesty to anyone. Whereas South Africa and Mozambique, they were very obligated to hold democratic elections to ensure peace, and they're also obligated to offer amnesty to any violators who committed politically motivated violence during the time. And so these differences are huge in determining peace after the war. And as the author puts, as Koban states, an examination of the data above clearly indicates that South Africa and Mozambique, whose conflicts were ended in the 1992-1994 period as a result of negotiations that involved offers of amnesty to former rights abusers, experienced a considerably better general outcome than did Rwanda, where the conflict was ended through a military victory and left the victors quite free of any obligation to provide amnesties or to use democratic rather than violent means to address countries' remaining political differences. And so, as you can see, the main difference between these cases is offering amnesty and creating what I think is the most important policy for promoting peace after war, which is creating a democratic, domesticated environment that's really going to emphasize human rights. So the reason I think that's the most important is because you're not going to be able to really end the conflict or hatred or promote, peaceful resolutions if people aren't giving basic human rights and there's not, equality within the society. Because once you give people their basic human rights and equality and a political voice, once that's achieved, it's very hard to take away people's rights and their voice, because these people are going to grow accustomed to having, a political voice, having political power, having human rights. And that's just going to create a culture and a society that's more trusting, more economically sound, and there's just going to be so many more benefits that are going to promote peace. And so all these other meta tasks Koban listed obviously are crucial and very important, but I don't think any of them could really succeed without, a democratic, human right emphasis environment. And so I think that does it. Thank you very much. I will see you next week.